Good day. I'm going to be devoting a fair part of this article to the rapidly deteriorating relations between the United States and China. But before I get to this point, let me first of all provide an update about the military situation in Ukraine, which has been developing rapidly again over the last couple of hours. And I'm going to suggest over the course of this video that the conflict in Ukraine and the problems between the United States and China are now becoming interconnected with each other in certain rather concerning ways. Let me first of all start with the big news this morning, which is that over the last couple of hours, there was another massive Russian missile attack on Ukraine. Now, it's extremely difficult to get, again, a full and comprehensive picture of what happens. The Russians do not provide either a figure for the number of missiles launched or the makeup of the missiles launched. But Ukraine says that 81 missiles were launched by the Russians, of which 6 were hypersonic Kinzhal missiles. Now that, by the way, would be a record, as far as I know, of the number of Kinzhal hypersonic missiles used in any individual strike. Of the remaining 75, it's a reasonable guess that these form a mix of KH-101 missiles launched by Russian bombers, to be precise, Tupolev 95 bombers from within Russia, and Kalibr missiles, presumably launched by naval vessels in the Black Sea. Though I can't confirm that, and I'm not absolutely sure whether in fact any Kalibr missiles were launched at all over the course of this strike, but I'm going to assume that they were. There's also evidence, in fact not evidence, there's multiple reports that over the course of the missile strike, there was a heavy strike by uranium-2 drones, and that those were also operating across Ukraine. And it seems that targets all across Ukraine were hit, though, as is becoming increasingly common with these missile strikes, the targets are now becoming more complex, and as the strikes become more complex, the targeting becomes both wider and more varied. The early strikes, the ones that started in October, focused very heavily on Ukraine's energy system, and certainly a part of these strikes, these latest strikes, also seem to have targeted Ukraine's energy system, and we're already getting reports of power blackouts in places like Kiev, in Kharkiv, in other places as well. But I have increasingly come to the view that one of the major targets, one of the major purposes of these strikes is to deplete and run down Ukraine's air defense system. And there was a report, which of course I can't confirm, but which came from a Ukrainian channel, that the Ukrainian authorities have had to reduce the number of S-300 missiles that they launched. They've had to ration the quantity of S-300 missiles they launch against these Russian missile attacks, because the stock of S-300 missiles has now become very seriously depleted. Ukraine is unable to replace this stock. There were reports a couple of days ago that the first Patriot missile battery has arrived from Poland. Presumably, this is the one that was going to be supplied to Ukraine by Germany. It was trundled off to Poland, and the Poles say that they've now supplied it to the Ukrainians. Of course, I can't confirm that, but it's plausible. And there were also reports that the United States has completed training of Ukrainian troops who are going to be using the Patriot missile system, which, by the way, if true, and if it is also true that these Ukrainian personnel only started to receive their training on using the Patriot system a few months ago when President Biden announced that Patriot missiles would indeed be supplied to Ukraine, assuming, that is to say, that the training did not begin before then, which is possible, then I'm going to say straightforwardly, if that is indeed the case, if it was not the case, if it was the case that training began when the Patriot missile system delivery was announced, then the Ukrainian personnel who are going to be operating this very complex and very difficult missile system are not fully trained to do so. But we'll wait and see what the facts are about that before very long. But anyway, here we see complex missile strike, partly, as I said, directed at the energy system, partly directed at depleting the Ukrainian defenses, the Ukrainian air defenses, and that may not be unconnected to the fact that we're seeing more visible action by the Russian Air Force, particularly in the area of Avdiivka, which is perhaps one of the most heavily fortified areas of the front line of the Ukrainian defense system, town directly opposite Donetsk city. It's very close to Donetsk city. And the Russians have been dropping gravity bombs from their fighter bombers, apparently Sukhoi 30s and Sukhoi 34s primarily, on Ukrainian defenses in Avdiivka. By the way, a couple of days ago, a Russian Sukhoi 34 jet was shot down over Avdiivka, but Russian reports suggest that this was a friendly fire incident. In other words, it was shot down by apparently the air defenses of the Donbass militia, not by the Ukrainians. Anyway, that's what the Russians have been saying. So the Russians have begun this gravity bombing of Avdiivka. They're starting to sense, I think, that even despite the delivery of this Patriot missile battery, the Ukrainian air defenses are becoming increasingly depleted, and it's becoming safer for them to fly their aircraft and to launch airstrikes with gravity bombs, which is something that they haven't done in the past. And here I'm going to mention one of the people who regularly provides me with updates of things, a person from India. He has discussed in the past how he's one of the people who's explained to me in the past why using gravity bombs would be more effective than artillery strikes in demolishing fortifications. And he's been absolutely right about this. And he also has recently speculated that the Russians would be using FAB 500 bombs, which weigh around 300 kilograms, and which have warheads that carry around 300 kilograms of explosive. And it turns out, once more, that he is absolutely right. That is exactly the bomb that the Russians apparently are using in Avdiivka. So anyway, a complex Russian missile strike, more signs that the Russians are now conducting a bombing campaign on at least one part of the Ukrainian defenses along the front line. I'm going to come to the implications of that fairly soon, by the way. Now, it ought to be said that the other most spectacular aspect of this particular Russian missile strike is the use of these 6 Kinzhal missiles. And that suggests that the Russians have successfully built up a significant stockpile of these missiles. And I wonder what exactly it was that these Kinzhal missiles were used for. And I'm going to make what I think is an educated guess, which is that I suspect that they specifically targeted Ukrainian air defense systems. What apparently has been happening is that the Ukrainians have been, as I said, rationing their use of S-300 missiles. The Russians have their AWACS aircraft, the A-50U mainstay aircraft in Belarus, which gives them information about where the air defense systems are located. They're not just monitoring radars, the Ukrainian radars, when they come on and off, as these missiles home in. They're able to track the launch of the Ukrainian air defense missiles themselves. And I think what the Russians are doing is that as soon as a Ukrainian air defense missile is launched, the MiG-31 fighter jets in Belarus and perhaps the Sukhoi 57 fighter jets, the more advanced 5th generation Sukhoi 57 fighter jets in over Donbass. I'm not absolutely sure that they can carry the Kinzhal, but never mind. But certainly the MiG-31s immediately launch Kinzhal missiles to strike at the air defense launch sites. And they're probably doing so with devastating effect, and they're accelerating the destruction that way of the Ukrainian air defense system. And I anticipate, and I'm guessing, that the Patriot missile system, which apparently is not yet in operation, will be a particular target of these MiG-31s over the next couple of weeks. Anyway, that's, I think, what has happened with this missile strike. So we can see part of what is going on. Still, the Russians attack the energy system. The Ukrainians have to defend it. The Russians may have bigger plans for this energy system eventually. They may be intending at some point to knock it out entirely, perhaps in conjunction with whatever big offensive the Russians eventually launch. More about that soon. But in the meantime, they're depleting the Ukrainian air defense system. They are doing so both by forcing Ukraine to launch missiles to shoot down Russian cruise missiles and uranium drones as these home in. These Russian cruise missiles targeting Ukrainian energy facilities. And when that launch happens, the Russians are able to track the launch, and they're able, at extraordinary speeds, with these hypersonic missiles, to launch counterstrikes on the launch points before the Ukrainians have time to relocate their launchers, the hypersonic missiles, leaving them very little time in order to do that before the hypersonic missile arrives. So that's, I think, what we are seeing. Now, let's talk, however, about information on the front lines. Now, the first thing to say is that there was apparently, over the last few days, a day or so, a Ukrainian attempt to launch some kind of a counterattack near Bakhmut. And the Russians claimed that this attack, this Ukrainian counterattack, was repelled Ukrainian attack. This is from TASS. Ukrainian troops attempted to counterattack in one of the sections in Artyomovsk called Bakhmut by Ukraine. This is from TASS. But the attack was repelled, and the Russian forces are moving forward. Acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic, Denis Pushilin, said on Thursday. The enemy made an attempt to counterattack in one of the sections there, but this attempt failed. Our units are advancing there. And this was all said by Pushilin over the course of an interview with Russia 24 TV, which took place apparently early this morning. And Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's again been very busy and very active and is still complaining about ammunition shortages, has told us that, in fact, another village in the area of Bakhmut has also been captured. And Prigozhin says that the village, this is again from TASS, the village of Dubovo-Vasilievka, northwest of Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, known as Bakhmut in Ukraine, is fully under control of Russian troops. Wagner PMC founder Yevgeny Prigozhin reported on Thursday. Dubovo-Vasilievka is fully under control of the Wagner private military company. Fighting is taking place on the outskirts. The entire village is under our control. Prigozhin's press service quoted him as saying on its Telegram channel. Now, that is a village some distance away from this remaining corridor along which the Ukrainians try to send troops in and out of Bakhmut. And in relation to this, there's been comments now from General Syrsky, who is the commander of the Ukrainian ground forces, and he seems to be committing Ukraine to a further defense of Bakhmut. He says, this is a quotation that I've got from the Slavyangrad channel, but I'm sure that this is correct. The commander of the ground forces of Ukraine, Alexander Syrsky, said that the relevance of holding Bakhmut is constantly growing. Each day of the defense of the city allows us to gain time to prepare reserves and prepare for the upcoming offensive operations. At the same time, in the battles for this fortress, the enemy loses the most prepared and combat-ready part of his troops, the Wagner assault detachments. Now, notice that Syrsky is now saying that the Wagner assault detachments are the best prepared and most combat-ready part of the Russian military active in the war. This is something of a change from what we've been hearing reasonably recently, that the Wagner forces in Bakhmut are basically poorly trained, poorly prepared convicts thrown into the meat grinder by the Russians in order to swamp the Ukrainians in Bakhmut with human wave tactics. Syrsky appears to think that, on the contrary, they're the best part of the Russian military fighting in the war. I'm not saying, by the way, that he's necessarily right, but it's certainly a shift in the explanation, in the description of the Wagner forces coming from the side of Ukraine. Now, there have also been reports that over the last few hours there's been more cases of Ukrainian soldiers fleeing from Bakhmut, and I've now seen reports from the Russian side that they're increasingly doing this without orders from their commanders. And that leads me to think that that destruction of the bridge, which took place a few days ago, was indeed intended to stem an uncontrolled retreat from Bakhmut, and I suspect it's largely succeeded in doing so. Some Ukrainian troops have indeed fled, but they're probably in relatively few numbers. Crossing the fields and using the country lanes is probably exceptionally difficult and dangerous to do. Using the roads, you might be able to get through on the roads if you're very careful and if you're not using vehicles. So that seems to be the purpose of the Ukrainians in blowing up that bridge. They've set up a pontoon bridge there, but presumably they can control it better. And in the meantime, Syrskyi is making it clear that despite the fact that Ukraine has lost control of all of Bakhmut east of the Bakhmutka River, it's determined to go on fighting there, even though the rationale has shifted once more. Now, on that topic, Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, has now said that Bakhmut may eventually fall. And he's quoted as saying, "We cannot rule out that Bakhmut may eventually fall in the coming days." And he said that this won't necessarily, note the word necessarily, be a turning point in the conflict, but he highlights the need to provide urgent assistance, including ammunition, to Ukraine. So despite Syrskyi's assertions that Ukraine must defend Bakhmut, that defending Bakhmut is becoming more important, Stoltenberg appears to think that Ukraine is probably going to lose Bakhmut, perhaps as soon as over the course of the next few days. And there's been a very interesting article in the Financial Times about all of this, and it now openly criticizes Ukrainian tactics in Bakhmut. It says Ukraine's battle of diminishing returns for Bakhmut. Eastern Ukrainian city has become an attritional trap where both sides seek to deplete each other's ranks. Now, can I say this is an article behind a paywall, and for that reason, I'm not going to quote it. I'm not going to quote it in detail. What I will say about it is this. It again makes the very, very bold assumption that the Russians are suffering heavier losses in capturing Bakhmut than the Ukrainians are. It again references that NATO official who said that Russia is losing 5 men in Bakhmut for every 1 Ukrainian who is killed there. I've already made clear my complete disbelief in this for this claim. I don't think that it is true at all, and I repeat my view that I think this NATO official is probably British, and I'm also going to say that I have a shrewd idea who that official might be, but I'm not going to say more because I may very well be wrong and I don't want to name the wrong person. So, to some extent, this article nonetheless, to some extent, appears to stick with the official mantra that the Russians have been suffering heavier losses in Bakhmut than the Ukrainians have. But the article then does say Ukraine is taking heavily losses too, potentially changing the cost-benefit assessment of holding on to the city. And then he goes on to say that Zelensky has raised the stakes, ordering his armed forces to reinforce their positions there, and warning that abandoning Bakhmut would leave the Russians an open road to the rest of Donetsk province, which Moscow is determined to seize. And the Financial Times says that this is contrary to Lloyd Austin's comment about a Ukrainian retreat from Bakhmut not being an operational or strategic setback. Interesting, by the way, that Ukrainian retreats would not be, from an American perspective, an operational or strategic setback, even though Russian retreats are always spoken of as if they are. And of course, the Financial Times also quotes Stoltenberg as saying that the loss of Bakhmut would not be a turning point. And the Financial Times says that Ukraine is repeating what it did last year when it depleted Russian forces in the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk fighting, and that this opened the way for a Ukrainian counteroffensive in the autumn. I'm going to say straight away that that is a misrepresentation, in my opinion, of what actually happened in the summer. I think the Ukrainians suffered heavier losses, much heavier losses in the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk fighting than the Russians did. In fact, at one point, as I remember, the Ukrainians were complaining that they were losing 1,000 men killed a day over the course of that fighting. But again, I'm not going to reiterate all of this. But anyway, the article then goes on to say that the question asked by Western officials and experts is, however, whether Ukrainian losses in men and material might hinder its own capacity for a counteroffensive. At the very least, the losses might argue in favour of withdrawal to a new defensive line. And the article then quotes Michael Kaufman, who is a well-known military commentator, very much on the Ukrainian side. Apparently he was born in Ukraine. But I will say something, I find him one of the more interesting military commentators about the war. But anyway, it says that he quotes Kaufman as saying that whilst Ukrainian losses in Bakhmut, their effect on Ukraine's ability to conduct a counteroffensive might be overstated, he nonetheless thinks that the main question is to what extent does defense of Bakhmut represent a strategy with diminishing returns relative to other options. So, there we go. And another paragraph. Some experts worry that Ukraine may be expending high-quality troops and equipment to kill mere Russian prison recruits as cannon fodder, but analysts at the Institute for the Study of War said Wagner was committing some of its elite forces to Bakhmut and that Russian airborne forces had also joined the fight. Anyway, there we go. Criticism from the West about the defense of Bakhmut, the losses Ukraine is suffering. Note that this article reduces everything to a question of attrition and tries to turn the issue of attrition round. So Bakhmut is not a case of Russia inflicting attrition on Bakhmut, which is what Prigozhin has been saying, which is what the Russians have been saying. It is the reverse. It is Ukraine inflicting attrition on the Russians. And we have anonymous Western officials who talk in that way, some commentators who talk in that way. No actual attempt to address the information from the BBC Media Zone analysis, which puts Russian losses over the course of this war at only a fraction of the size that Western commentators are claiming. And no real explanation also of the size of Ukrainian losses. And of course, Zelensky's comment, which is also mirroring a comment made by Shoigu, that the fall of Bakhmut would open the way for further Russian advances in Donetsk region, with the Russians able to push forward towards Kramatorsk and Slavyansk and to roll up Ukrainian defences in Donetsk. That's only briefly reported and left unexplored. It's something which I get the sense Western commentators, it's a point that Western commentators are unwilling to address. Let me say straight away that, in my opinion, it is Ukraine which has suffered by far the heaviest attrition in Bakhmut. It's probably true that the Ukrainian troops who have been increasingly fighting in Bakhmut itself are not Ukraine's best forces. But of course, one should not be in too much of a rush to dismiss the effect on Ukrainian morale. And I'm not going to even discuss the humanitarian considerations here of sacrificing the lives of hundreds of men, even if they're lower caliber soldiers, in a battle like Bakhmut. But I have no doubt at all that though the Russian objective in Bakhmut has indeed been to inflict immense attrition on Ukraine, Prigozhin, of course, has said as much, and even though I think the Russians have been largely successful in achieving that, I also think that the Russians do want to capture Bakhmut, and they do see this as this route to advancing upon other parts, other places in Donetsk region. And I think that is the primary reason why Ukraine has defended this town so bitterly, despite the enormous losses it is suffering. Now, there's more and more reports that the Ukrainians are trying to assemble some kind of battle groups to try to relieve the garrison in Bakhmut. I've seen reports that 2 or 3 brigades are being assembled. It seems the ground is becoming increasingly soft. I've discussed the difficulties that might cause Ukraine if they launch such an attack. And of course, they would be advancing into the hail of the Russian artillery. And perhaps not just the Russian artillery, because let me come back to my earlier points about the depletion of the Ukrainian air defense system. It looks as if the Russians are now able to use their air force more aggressively than they have been able to do until recently. They're now starting to use it heavily in the Avdiivka area, and they've been bombing Ukrainian defenses, and they seem to be making significant progress there. And quite possibly, conceivably, before long, they will start doing the same further north in and around Bakhmut. And if Ukrainian forces start trying to push forward in Bakhmut, well, it might not just be artillery, but Russian bombing that is also unleashed against them, and that might be a grim outcome for Ukraine. Having said that, I don't want to preempt what Ukraine might do, and we will just have to wait and see whether Ukraine does launch a counterattack, whether they do regain some ground and perhaps punch a hole through the cauldron around Bakhmut, which is still, by the way, far from sealed, fully sealed. It's not yet, really thick cauldron like the one in Mariupol was. We'll see what the Ukrainians are able to do. But certainly Syrski's comments suggest to me that the Ukrainians are not going to give up on Bakhmut, and that more fighting in and around this town is probably coming. Meanwhile, We also had reports about further Russian advances in the Kremenaya and Kupiansk area, all fairly sketchy. And I've already discussed the situation in Avdiivka. And the Russians have also provided further statements about their defences in Zaporozhye region, which many see as the most likely area of a Ukrainian offensive. And this comes again from TASS, and it quotes Yevgeny Balitsky, who is the head of the Russian-appointed regional government in Zaporozhye region. And Balitsky says this, according to TASS, Russian forces have prepared deeply echeloned defenses in the Zaporozhye region, and the military is ready to repel a potential Ukrainian counteroffensive. We are getting ready for this Ukrainian counteroffensive. We have quite a strong double line of defense. The military has reported that they are ready, he told Russia 24 television. Balitsky highlighted, this is from TASS, the role of the administration in defense, for which he said the military was primarily responsible. We monitor supplies for the army and help maintain the supplies, the acting governor specified. According to Balitsky, there were about 40,000 Ukrainian troops near the locality of Prishib in the Kiev-controlled part of the region. And TASS points out that Vladimir Rogov, who is one of Balitsky's deputies, on Monday, that's just 2 days ago, 3 days ago, put the number at less than that, at between 30 to 32,000. So it may be that there's been a faster Ukrainian build-up over the last few days, or it could be that Balitsky and Rogov are counting Ukrainians slightly differently, who's to say? But anyway, one way or the other, there's a significant Ukrainian force in Zaporozhye region, building up in Zaporozhye region. But according to Balitsky, the Russians are ready. And of course, we've seen pictures of these enormous defenses that have been constructed in this area following Surovikin's appointment in September as Russia's overall commander, a role in which he's been superseded since then by General Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff, but which I suspect in actuality he largely retains. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about the battlefronts. Let's now return to a number of other topics. And before I turn to China, I want to say a few things first about the 6 guys and a boat story that's circulating in the Western media yesterday and the day before, alleging that the Nord Stream attack had nothing to do with any NATO government, but it was the work of 6 guys and a boat, and that this was perhaps connected to Ukraine, but then perhaps not. You know, nobody can say. And we've heard reports since then that the German authorities have raided the boat in question, a yacht, and that they found Ukrainian passports there, which these 6 guys conveniently left behind, perhaps traces of explosive. I'm not absolutely sure about that, but anyway, that's what we're hearing. Now, I've had a deluge of information about this from all sorts of interested people, and they all make the same point, that the story makes absolutely no sense. Some of these interested people are people with knowledge of these matters. They point out that the kind of diving equipment that amateurs use would not be possible, could not possibly be used to reach the depths at which these pipes were located, and a small yacht would certainly not have the facilities to support divers in that kind of operation. I have to say that the idea that only 2 divers could do this also seems to me, on the face of it, bizarre. And there have also been points about the enormous dangers of basically piling up such vast quantities of explosive on this yacht. Anyway, the sum total of all of this is that more and more people seem to think that this is a story that really just doesn't add up. And they may be right, because I notice that the media, having carried this story briefly, appears to be losing interest in publicising it. Anyway, as I said, I will wait to see if these 6 guys on a boat and the 6 guys who were in the boat and the Ukrainian oligarch who apparently funded them, whether they're called in for questioning, whether they're identified, whether they're charged. I mean, seems to be, on the face of it, if you believe the story, enough evidence to at least do some of these things. And it's curious, that's all I get to say, curious, that up to now that hasn't happened. Let me turn now to China. And before I do, before I talk about what the Chinese are saying, I want to now discuss a comment made by the US Director of National Intelligence, Haynes, in a report that she gave to Congress. Now, I remember when Haynes gave a similar report last year, and in the summer of last year, and I'm going to say straight away that my overall sense is that this report, though it tries to put a fairly optimistic spin, is nonetheless overall more pessimistic than the report that she gave in the summer. She seemed, for example, extremely she was very, very careful to downplay the prospects of success of Ukraine's counteroffensive. She didn't seem to be confident that Ukrainian counteroffensive, if and when it takes place, that it will succeed. And that's just one example. She seemed to talk about the best outcome being some kind of long stalemate, and she seemed to concede the possibility that the longer the war continues, the more Russia and Putin, it's always Putin, ultimately benefits. So, as I said, a more pessimistic take of the war overall than one I remember Haynes giving around 6 months ago. But there was one comment that she made which stood out for me. Haynes said that it was unlikely that the Russians had the necessary numbers of men and equipment to carry forward their offensive. About the men, I don't really understand, by the way. I mean, we've had a call-up of 300,000 men. There's also been significant numbers of volunteers, as I've discussed many times, and as has been admitted, even by Western officials, the bulk of those reserves have not been committed to any battle. And we've been hearing all kinds of reports from all sorts of Western sources about huge build-ups of aircraft, tanks, that kind of thing on the Russian side, on the battlefronts. I saw figures of 1,800 tanks, for example, and hundreds of aircraft being deployed. So I'm not quite sure why she thinks that Russia is short of men. But the particular passage that stood out for me was this one. If Russia does not initiate a mandatory mobilization and identify substantial third-party ammunition supplies, it will be increasingly challenging for them to sustain the current level of offensive operations in the coming months. Now, notice those words: identify substantial third-party ammunition supplies. Now, Haynes was asked about China. She said that so far the US has no evidence that China is supplying arms to Russia. She also said that overall the US assessment is that President Xi Jinping does not want to involve China in a sanctions war with the United States, which I think is probably true. But consider those words: identify substantial third-party ammunition supplies, because that phrase could mean various things. It could mean that Haynes does actually believe that the Russians are running out of ammunition. I mean, that's what those words say. And maybe that's what Haynes generally thinks. Or it could be that this is a hint or a warning to the Chinese. We said elsewhere, we don't think you want a sanctions war. If you are thinking of supplying ammunition to the Russians, a sanctions war is what you're going to get. There is another possibility, and it's a rather ominous one, and that is that if the Russians do engage in an offensive at some point over the next few months, and if that offensive gains ground, Haynes has now made it possible to blame the Chinese for the outcome. Because if one puts aside Iran and North Korea, China is by far the most likely third-party supplier of ammunition to Russia. I'm not, by the way, saying that the Chinese have any plans to supply ammunition to Russia, or that the Russians need China to supply them with ammunition. But consider this is what Haynes is saying. So she's saying that the Russians are running out of ammunition. As I said, perhaps she believes it. But perhaps her primary purpose is just prepare the ground to blame the Chinese if there is an offensive and the Russians are successful. You can continue to insist that the Russians were running out of ammunition until the Chinese supposedly came to their rescue. That may not be true, but these words do open up that possibility. Now, let's return to what the Chinese themselves are saying. And on Tuesday, the new Chinese foreign minister, Qin Gang, gave a press conference. And I have to say it was a very impressive press conference. For a new foreign minister, of course, he's an experienced diplomat. He's recently been Chinese ambassador to the United States. He's somebody who clearly is a very experienced diplomat. But nonetheless, this is his first meet the press occasion. And I have to say, overall, the press conference was a magisterial affair. It showed a man fully in command of his brief. And of course, he's not the person in overall charge of Chinese foreign policy. That remains Wang Yi, with, of course, President Xi Jinping remaining in overall charge. But nonetheless, we see that the new Chinese foreign minister is certainly up to the job. And over the course of that press conference, he made certain comments about relations with the United States. And as we will see, those comments were widely publicized and picked up by the Chinese media. So these are not off-the-cuff comments made by an inexperienced foreign minister who's asked a question and then jumps and falls, goes off the deep end without really thinking carefully about what he's going to say. On the contrary, what this new Chinese foreign minister said is clearly intended to set out the feeling of the Chinese authorities, the Chinese government. And I'm going to read the official Chinese text of this press conference. And first of all, he talks about the balloon incident, and he talks about the anti-Chinese campaign that the United States launched over the course of the balloon incident. He talks about how this all degenerated for no reason into a diplomatic crisis. He said that the US shooting down of the balloon was a violation of the spirit of international law and international customary practices. But then he goes on to say that an accident, which is what, as far as he's concerned, this balloon incident was, can reveal something fundamental. In this case, the US perception and views of China are seriously distorted, and I'm quoting his words. It regards China as its primary rival and biggest geopolitical challenge. This is like the first button in a shirt being put wrong, and the result is that the US-China policy has entirely deviated from the rational and sound track. Now, this is an official Chinese translation. Note the use of the word rational. So we're being told, this is Tin Gang saying, the Americans are going crazy. And then comes the real killer, the comments that are the real killer. And again, I'm quoting again. This is the next section is taken straight from the official Chinese transcript. The United States claims that it seeks to outcompete China, but does not seek conflict. Yet, in reality, its so-called competition means to contain and suppress China in all respects and get the two countries locked in a zero-sum game. The United States talks a lot about following rules, but imagine two athletes competing in an Olympic race. If one athlete, instead of focusing on giving one's best, always tries to trip or even injure the other, that is not fair competition, but malicious confrontation and a foul. The US is so-called establishing guardrails for China-US relations and not seeking conflict actually means that China should not respond in words or actions when it is slandered or attacked. That is just impossible. If the United States does not hit the brake but continues to speed down the wrong path, no amount of guardrails can prevent derailing, and there will surely be conflict and confrontation. Who will bear the catastrophic consequences? Such competition is a reckless gamble, with the stakes being the fundamental interests of the two peoples and even the future of humanity. Naturally, China is firmly opposed to all this. If the United States has the ambition to make itself great again, it should also have a broad mind for the development of other countries. Containment and suppression will not make America great, and it will not stop the rejuvenation of China. And then he also had a lot more to say about the situation over Taiwan. And again, he made it fairly clear that he blames the United States for the deterioration over the Taiwan issue, and in further comments, though he was more guarded in what he said, he also made it fairly clear that he blames the United States for the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the fact that there have been no peace talks, which he says that efforts for peace talks have been repeatedly undermined. I'm quoting again from him, there seems to be an invisible hand for the protraction and escalation of the conflict and using the Ukraine crisis to serve certain geopolitical agenda. And of course, it's not difficult to guess, in light of his other words about the US, whom he means. And we've had the follow-up editorials from Global Times, and there's a very strong one, and it reads, arouse vigilance, there's been two editorials, in fact, since Sin Gang's comments, drawing from his press conference, but perhaps the more vigorous one is the later one, the one that's come out today, March 9th, arouse vigilance, opposition around the world against wolves. And we go on to read that the comparison with a wolf is being made. It is the United States that is the wolf that's referred to in the headline of this editorial. And the editorial says, some in the US are eager to criticize China, even when China just speaks the truth. This itself is part of the fangs of the wolf. In recent years, the US's containment and suppression of China in politics, economy, technology, culture, and other fields all conform to the behavioral characteristics of a wolf. Some anti-China politicians in Washington who are constantly targeting and attacking China are a vivid portrayal of the wolf image. And there's a lot more of that, and it speaks at one time that when it relentlessly presses China like a hungry wolf with an insatiable appetite for geopolitics, China will be portrayed as the number one threat if it picks up weapons for self-defense, and the United States will constantly elevate its offensive posture. But where exactly has China threatened the United States? We're afraid that many Americans have no answer to that. For many Washington elites, China's development and the Chinese people's desire for a better life are a kind of original sin, because in Washington's memory, wealth is accumulated through plunder and slaughter. These are strong words, and as I said, they come from Global Times, and they follow on from what Sin Gang is saying. I have to say that I read all of this with extraordinary concern. It looks to me, and I get to say this bluntly, that, as I said, there's many different factions fighting it out in Washington about the direction of US policy in Ukraine. It seemed to me that Haynes, at least the Director of National Intelligence, is trying to hedge. She's trying to say, well, on the one hand, the Russians are almost out of ammunition. They're not able to advance. But on the other hand, we're not convinced that Ukraine will be able to advance either. But at the same time, she's setting up the Chinese for blame in case the Russians do, contrary to what she says, manage an advance in Ukraine. And this, of course, coming on top of all the vitriolic comments about China that we now see, and also reports that Kevin McCarthy, the House Speaker, is about to visit Taiwan, following in the footsteps of his Democrat predecessor, Nancy Pelosi, who also visited Taiwan, provoking huge anger in China just a few months ago. So the Chinese are seeing all of this. They're seeing how the United States is seeking to contain them, is seeking to suffocate their economic development through trying to stop, for example, the export of high-end chip technology to China, something that the Chinese are responding to. In fact, there's a lot of information recently about the fact that the Chinese are actually ahead of the United States in the greater number of technologies. I'm not going to discuss that in this program. I'm hardly an expert in that field. But anyway, the Chinese are clearly exasperated. They see the United States actively working to set up a confrontation in Taiwan. They ask, as the Global Times article does, rather plaintively, well, how are we threatening the United States? We've always said that Taiwan was part of our territory. We've never changed our stance over Taiwan. We're not considering any threats against the United States or against any US allies. We might have disputes over islands with some of them, but we're always prepared to sit down and talk about them. And yet, despite that, despite the fact that we are not threatening the United States seems to be spoiling for a fight with us. And the foreign minister, Chinese foreign minister Qin Gang, is now saying that the situation is deteriorating, that there's no sign that the United States is capable of compromise with China. The Chinese have undoubtedly seen how the United States has stirred up the whole issue of the prospect or possibility of Chinese ammunition supplies to Russia, something which the Chinese have said they no plan to do, that the US has been using that story in order to put pressure on its European allies to impose sanctions on China. And the Chinese are drawing conclusions. They're saying that we're heading towards confrontation, and in light of this, unless this train of confrontation, a brake is placed on it in the United States, a confrontation with the United States now looks inevitable. Now, given that this is the view that the Chinese have made, and notice how Qin Gang makes the point that the incident with the balloon has crystallized thinking in Beijing, that the Chinese found the American response over the balloon so over the top, so completely irrational, that it demonstrated the extent of the visceral anti-Chinese sentiment, which, as far as the Chinese are concerned, has now gained hold in Washington. The Chinese are saying to themselves, well, given that realistically the US is not going to change direction, we have no real option but to prepare our defenses. And in fact, over the last few days, China has announced a big increase in defense spending by 7%. And I have to say, with Xi Jinping heading towards Moscow, and with a flurry of headlines now in the international media about how China and Russia are drawing even closer together, I can't help but think that with the Chinese having concluded that a confrontation of some kind with the United States is now inevitable, and with the Chinese also having concluded that a sanctions war against China is an inevitable part of that as well, that from the Chinese point of view, there is now no real incentive against supplying the Russians with ammunition if that is what the Russians need. And there might even before long be a positive incentive to do so, given how, as I've discussed before, the war in Ukraine is absorbing US energies, depleting Western arsenals, weakening the US potentially in advance of a confrontation with China. Now, I have to say, this is all looking rather dark, and perhaps it is, but we have seen how the Chinese, as I said, are now responding to this campaign that they see coming out of the United States. Now, all I'm going to say is this: if one effect of this campaign is indeed to cause the Chinese to supply ammunition to the Russians, I'm not saying the Russians need it or want it. I'm not saying that the Chinese are planning to provide it, but if pressure from the United States causes the Chinese to think that it might be a good idea to do that, and I'm starting to see how they might think that, and it's important to say that in public comments made recently, they have not ruled it out. If that's what the Chinese do, and if they do it because of American pressure, and if we have a sanctions war at a time when the Western economies are already apparently edging towards recession, and when inflation in all the major Western economies is already rising, then all I can say is that we have further proof that whom the gods destroy, they first make mad. Well, that's me for the day. No doubt more from me soon on many topics. We will see whether Ukraine does launch its counteroffensive in Bakhmut and what happens there over the next few days. And obviously we'll keep an eye out for news about Xi Jinping's trip to Moscow. Thank you very much for joining me again today, and more from me soon.